Open for business, one of the world's biggest free trade zones, has now come into effect in Africa. But many argue the continent lacks proper infrastructure to implement the agreement. So is Africa ready for the free movement of goods and people? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobby. A new year and a new start for Africa. The world's largest single market has now opened, enabling all but one of the 54 nations to begin trading. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a landmark deal bringing together the continent's multi-trillion-dollar economy into one bloc. It's the culmination of years of work, negotiations and delays. And while only 33 of these signatories have put the deal into effect, it's already being heralded as a turning point for Africa's economic future. Ahmed Idris reports.
Workers at this garment factory rushed to deliver thousands of face masks. The owner says more than 2.5 million were met here to help Niger control the spread of COVID-19. But as the Africa Free Trade Agreement comes into effect, he foresees trouble ahead for the continent's poorer countries.
Small and poor economies will always be at a disadvantage. Hopefully, as time goes on, we can get special considerations. Otherwise, it will be difficult to compete.
Businesses in poor countries may have their concerns, but overall, experts say the agreement will eventually benefit them. They believe the cheap cost of labor in these countries will attract more industries.
Intra-African trade can spur industrial development. The level and pace of industrialization among African countries vary. Some will have advantage over others, but African countries need to buy and sell raw and finished products among themselves.
Landlocked Niger currently imports most of its needs, from bottled water to food and machinery.
From big retail to local markets, Niger is flooded with imported products. Because of its weak infrastructure and industrial base, the country will continue to depend on imports, making it difficult for local industries to grow.
Experts say it's hard to see European and Asian multinational companies giving up the trade advantage they've held in Africa for a century. Products from Europe, Asia and Africa's larger economies line the shelves at Niamey's biggest retail monopoly. Consumers prefer these brands. Traders say there won't be many local goods on store shelves unless government steps in.
We should be given support. Government should facilitate easy acquisition of land and loans from banks.
But it's hard to see how governments on the continent can do that without breaching the protectionism rules of Africa Trade Agreement and the World Trade Organization. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera, Niamey.
Now, we have a panel of experts standing by, but first let's break down the numbers behind the deal. Well, under the agreement, tariffs will be eliminated on 90% of goods. That means in a market of 1.3 billion people with a combined GDP of $2.5 trillion, trading will be nearly duty-free. The World Bank says that will increase the continent's income by $450 billion in the next 15 years. The bank also says Africa's exports, mostly in manufacturing, will get a $560 billion boost. And the agreement will raise wages, especially for women, who account for more than 70% of cross-border traders. And the free trade agreement promises to lift 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty. Okay, let's bring in our panel today. In Nairobi, we have David Owiro. He's the founder of the Africa Development Think Tank. In London, we have Paul Melly. He's a consulting fellow at Chatham House. And in Johannesburg, we have the economist Shanti Pai. He's a columnist at Business Day and the Financial Mail. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. David, in Nairobi, can I come to you first? For the countries who've signed up to this, what does this, in theory, mean for them?
Well, on the one hand, you've got a big opportunity not only to bolster your intra-African exports and imports, but as well as an opportunity to achieve your economic development goals of employment. For the reason that most of what is traded within Africa is actually originating from Africa. And so these tend to be Africa's value add in manufacturing sectors, And so there's a huge potential for not only creating greater employment opportunities, but also increasing incomes as you specialize and you generate greater value add in up your value chain.
Paul Melly in London, lots of people are saying, look, this means good or better infrastructure. But for some of the signatory countries, they don't have an infrastructure to speak of to start with anyway.
No, that's certainly true, particularly in the Central African region. I think it's really striking when you look at the map that West Africa is relatively integrated. Eastern Africa has quite a high degree of integration, the same for Southern Africa. But then right in the center of the continent is that huge Congo Basin region where the development of long-distance roads is only really getting underway now, linking the member countries, for example, of the Central African bloc, and where there are very few rail connections. And so the movement of goods from one part of the continent to another won't be quite as straightforward. And so I suspect that at the start of this process, we're really going to see perhaps a bit of an acceleration of integration and trading growth within the existing regions that are already more integrated, so in East, West and South, but that in the center of the continent, it will take longer for those countries to really begin to reap the benefits because their infrastructure is so thin.
Shantipai in Johannesburg, this also should mean a lot of external investment. There is already in certain of the African countries a lot of external investment, to the point of economic critics of certain external countries might say there's too much, because if you've got so much money being poured into an economy, it can skew the economy. And if that country is in effect in debt to trillions of US dollars, the economy is not coming back in the way, it's going out the way to the country that's doing the investing.
And that's absolutely true. And I think we've seen it also in particular, that actually also does not foster diversification of these economies. And so you actually find that, you only have a mining economy or an agricultural economy, and that actually makes it very difficult then to get the kinds of gains that you want to actually get from a much more industrialized and exporting kind of country, because obviously that if you are focused in particular areas and therefore you don't, for example, develop the skills, if you think about the Central African region in particular, where there's a lot of mining and of course agriculture, that stays primary in terms of this, the way it has been developed, and it does not grow into actually being able to be actually much more advanced, so that you can actually add the value and then export into the rest of the continent, and actually have then the other industries that will spring out of that. And I think one of the things that we really have to focus on is exactly that sort of thing. And I think one of the interesting things about that, of course, is that while we are actually talking about that investment that has been coming in, and I think this is something that people have complained about, in particular about China, is that you have investment that is also followed by labor or these kinds of skills that actually come into it rather than developing local skills. Because we don't just want, the movement of goods, but it has to be also the creation of skills, creation of jobs, and the upliftment of people's basic incomes. And so this has to actually be something that has to be paid extra attention to in terms of trade. But I think that is one of the key things that have to be actually developed. And I suspect the office that is being developed of the Secretariat is going to be quite central in actually trying to make sure that those things happen. But we know that this investment thing has been a problem, particularly for the African Union, where even funding African Union programs has been very difficult, from issues of infrastructure to peacekeeping. All of these things have been quite problematic, and one actually has to focus on those things. Otherwise, we're actually going to continue along the same path.
David Awira in Nairobi. There is also surely, on the part of the people who are driving this, there is an economic assumption that the fundamentals of every signatory country are basically sound, but they are not, And does that explain, say, for example, why Nigeria wasn't particularly keen on this idea of a free trading zone encompassing all of the African countries? Because the reality is, 5-6 months ago on this show, we were discussing how Nigeria was heading towards bankruptcy and it needed to borrow money from people not in Africa.
Yes, certainly. It warrants for analysts and keen observers of these affairs in Africa to also think about the political implications that the Continental Free Trade Area brings about with them. And certainly the hesitance that we saw from Nigeria perhaps provide insight to that. I know there was a lot of debate and discussion around, the small economies and the extent to which they would lose out, particularly if you look at West Africa, where Nigeria, sort of dominates those economies there, and actually is a key partner to almost all the West African, a large majority of the West African states. You would see that, there are certainly trade creation and trade diversion effects that would result, in an open continent-wide trading arrangement. But certainly, I think to the broader question, the aspect or the whole ambition behind the Continental Free Trade Area really lies in the motive of erasing or harmonizing, rather, the customs procedures and the addressing the trade barriers that have existed on the continent. Much as we have indeed, very different configurations and very unique economies, there is an argument to be made that, trade barriers have often largely stood in the way of not only trading, but also achieving the economic development that individual countries aspire to. And so if you take this as just one of the mechanisms by which economies can actually provide a way out for their economies to scale that development ladder, certainly it is a welcome idea.
Shanti Pai in Johannesburg, how can we achieve a situation where we have that harmonization there that we're hearing about as a go-to requirement if, and this is happening as we speak, there are certain borders that are closed because of conflict and or corruption between different countries' governments. There are not wars going on across Africa, but there are conflicts going on all over Africa.
And I think this has been a fundamental problem because I think, obviously, the whole idea that you wanted to silence the guns was also, I guess, to try and actually move towards development. But I think, one of the interesting things, actually, as we have been talking about conflicts and, this invisible war against COVID, that has also highlighted some of the problems that we continue to face. Just a few days ago here, in the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe, there's a big major problems actually of people passing through and goods passing through because obviously of the kinds of limitations that were put there in terms of people passing through. And between the two governments, it became nearly impossible to save people's lives. I mean, truck drivers died on that border. And that tells us something about how it is that we're actually going to be able to actually think about, how to actually manage crisis between, within countries. And then, of course, the idea that we actually want to be able to create a kind of smooth trade environment that will allow us to go. So, suddenly, the requirements could not be met where, you wanted the kind of testing. So, that very easy, seamless kind of discussion and actually planning that is necessary to be done by two countries that are relatively have had long trade relations. You find that as a crisis like COVID has actually created a major situation in which actually goods and people could not move through that area. And these are things that actually have to be expected and actually planned for. Because if we don't do that, then actually we are going to find that actually then we down trust of the investment because we don't want to obviously bring in investment to actually invest in these countries and within countries where you can develop the sector and then the trade itself does not happen because actually the kind of work that's necessary for trade to happen hasn't been done. And I think it's been very disappointing given the kind of work that should have been done a long time ago if we actually are serious about the kind of trade that we want to do, especially when there is already an established trade relationship.
Paul Melly in London, does a lot of that coming down to being serious about it also come down to political will? Because the reality is that an awful lot of African countries that we could talk about are less industrialized today than they were during the 1970s.
Quite a few have lost industry, but in a sense that's partly because of the evolution of the global economy towards a more high-tech basis and away from some of the old heavy industries that were experimented with in Africa in the immediate period after independence in a few countries. But on the whole, the technological evolution of the world economy has actually helped Africa. If one thinks of the mobile phone sector, for example, many countries never really developed a very strong fixed line network, but with mobile telecoms and all that's associated with it, and fiber optic and so on, the whole process has leapt forward hugely. And now there are countries where you can be in quite remote rural areas and yet have 4G access. And then that facilitates new economic activities, new forms of business and trading. But I think another key point is just this question of simplifying and reducing the administrative hassles and bureaucratic burdens that you find at borders, because every country, not just in Africa, any country in the world, obviously there's domestic political pressure, if you like, to look after domestic interests. And that can sometimes foster the development of barriers at borders. But when those barriers are able to be reduced through administrative reform and through cross-border negotiation, then it makes it easier to encourage not just more trade, but more high-quality trade. And we can see this, for example, in West Africa, that we're now beginning to see plans for the revival of car assembly plants, probably in Ghana and Nigeria. And because the trade barriers are going to be reduced at the borders, or are being reduced, it's possible to develop car plants that will be serving the West African region as a whole. And similarly, in West Africa, the region grows a lot of cotton, and most people wear cotton clothes. And yet at the moment, the textile industry is very thin and struggles to compete against Chinese competition. But we're beginning to see one or two pointers to new investment in modern textile plants that can be internationally competitive, so that West Africans can grow the cotton that is then transformed locally into clothes for that local market.
David, I mean, if we're talking about anything or areas of industry as diverse as car manufacturing and also the cotton industry, on the plus side, I guess that means people have jobs. But on the negative side, is there potential here for the financial benefits to be generated in Africa, but to flow out of the African countries that are already taking steps in that direction? Because that's why, for example, post-Brexit UK government trade ministers are already talking to some of the African countries, because they're thinking we can access low labour cost markets that in theory are built on lots of movement of industry, infrastructure and people, and the reality of dealing with those companies in that environment might be completely different to what it should be on paper.
Yes, you've got it on the head, Adrian. As you know, my South African colleague, and also what you've just provided now, provides the context to the larger picture that really, you know, a trade regulation, a trading framework really is not the end-all, be-all of you know, addressing all our key economic challenges. And so the example that you give that, you know, even if we do have this trading framework in place, it still doesn't address the greater challenges that are posed or brought about by the existing financial architecture of the globe that we have right now. And the reality is that Africa is indeed losing a lot. You know, some studies have estimated over 500 billion annually US dollars that Africa loses just because of the way the financial architecture is. And so that's not to say that we now don't implement you know, appropriate trade policies that could result in economic development for our countries. But really the question is, can we put this, can we, as we address the trade questions, also address other related significant policies that should be implemented or ought to be implemented in concert with this, such as to do with how our regulations that govern the financial architecture that impacts Africa, you know, as a key question, and also the other aspects that relate to issues of, you know, inclusiveness in terms of the kind of employment opportunities for women, for youth, and so forth that ought to come about. And so these are all questions that are important that we shouldn't forget, and that's why coming together from a continental perspective is important, because not only will we be able to put in place a trade policy, but also strategize and harmonize our sector policies that ought to be implemented in concert with that trade policy.
Okay.
And the key example here is we cannot be implementing infrastructure programs that are incoherent even within the African sub-regions. So the example is, go ahead.
Okay, Shanti Pai in Johannesburg, is it possible within this free trade agreement or free trade zone, as it now is as of today, to codify what David Awiro in Nairobi is talking about there, to codify that women get proper representation in the workplace, that they get paid the same as the equivalent men, that the crucial employment category when it comes to age, like the 18 to 34-year-olds, that they're in the proper jobs, especially given that some analysts are already calling this Empire 2, because all those colonial powers that gave countries back literally after the Second World War and then walked away, 80% walked away, some of those colonial powers, undoubtedly, the French, for example, will be looking in and going, oh, well, maybe we can start building Renaults and Citroëns in West Africa as the Nigerian economy pivots from oil and gas towards something else.
And that's absolutely true. And I think one of the things that we've absolutely got to guard against, I think one of the interesting things is that also, when we mentioned some of the negative things, one of the things that we've seen over a period of time is that, of course, this idea of comparative advantage is one key area that we have to look at. We know, for example, in South Africa, the education system and the skills system is very, very poor for the majority, but we know that, there are many other countries on the continent that have been very good in education, in literacy, in mathematics, and science, but then have not had the industry. And South Africa has developed industry over a period of time. And one thinks that one of the things one can do is, of course, is to transfer some of that. So where South African companies actually can transfer some of that industrial prowess into, for example, into the Central African region, where we know there's been a lot of, the French education, perhaps all those kinds of standards of French education, and one of those things that we can meet them together. And I see a lot of opportunities where actually, in the agricultural system in South Africa, that's been very successful, that's very industrialized. How do we actually transfer some of that skill? So one of the things we have to absolutely do is to actually make sure that these transfers actually happen, whether it's, and particularly so that we can actually build on the technologies, build on the industry, actually, and also use some of all this already seeded kind of skills development that has already happened on the continent. And I think one of the things that, of course, one has to guard against is that very idea of, I guess, what people call the second scramble for Africa, and then actually use some of that investment. I don't think that it is now possible to actually do development on the continent without, of course, external funding. But one has to then say, within this environment, how do we actually make sure that we are not going to re-exports?
Last word to Paul. Very briefly, Paul, we've got 60 seconds for you to answer this question. How and when do we know that this has been a success, given that especially the continent of Africa has 17% of the global workforce, but it only produces 3% of the global GDP?
I think we'll know if it is becoming a success if little by little we see that ratio beginning to shift, because Africa starts providing value added. I mean, to take issue with your point about Renault and Citroën coming in, at the moment, the point is the Renaults, the Citroëns, the Volkswagens, they're coming in, Toyotas, they're all coming in anyway. If you stand on the quayside at any West African port, you can see the car carrying ships importing all these vehicles. It's not that nobody has cars. And wouldn't it be better if some of those cars are at least assembled in the West African region and therefore employing people and with appropriate skills training, building up the value added? I mean, why should Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana always only produce cocoa? Why can't they produce chocolate? And you can apply that in sectors all over the continent. So the real test will be if we start to see the value added rising so that Africa's share of GDP starts to relate a bit more to its population. That means that people's living standards, their jobs, the range of skills that they can take up and use is gradually on the rise. I think that's the indicator to watch.
OK, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you to our guests today. They were David Awiro, Paul Melly and Shanti Pai. And thank you to you for watching. You can see the show again anytime via the website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also track us on Twitter at AJ Inside Story. From me, Peter Dobby, and the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We will see you very soon. For the moment, bye-bye.